Hello, everyone. I'm Theodora Goss, and this is the second lecture I'm giving to make up for the snow days that we're having so that we don't have to make them up in some other way. This lecture is going to be on fairy stories by J.R.R. Tolkien. Once again, I have my notes right here. And I also have my book. Now, those of you who are my students, you've got a version of this, put it on the other side, in PDF form. So you have the essay in PDF form. For anyone else who happens to be listening to this, the essay, my version of the essay is from the Tolkien Reader, which is an absolutely wonderful book. And I just want to point out for anyone watching that over my shoulder here, that you can't see it very well, but it's actually a drawing by Terry Winling, who, as we all know, is very important in fairy tale studies. So I'm rather pleased to be giving this lecture actually below her drawing. Okay, so we're going to talk about fairy stories, the essay by J.R.R. Tolkien, which is very important for us to be familiar with if we're studying fairy tales, because Tolkien is obviously an expert in fantasy literature in general, and also is someone who has written some very important books that draw on fairy tales in various ways. So it's important for us to find out what he has to say, and modern fairy tale scholars still refer back to Tolkien. So he's part of the history of the genre. Many of you know Tolkien as the author of The Hobbit and of The Lord of the Rings, and you don't necessarily know who he was in his other life, which is that he was a professor of Anglo-Saxon at Oxford. We're talking about someone who was a scholar and a top scholar in his field. He was a philologist. He was someone who knew about languages, about mythology, about the ancient world and the epic tradition. Someone who knew that stuff very, very well. So this lecture was given at the University of St. Andrews in 1938. It was published in 1947. So Tolkien took a while to revise and publish it, and there's a reason for that. If you think about what happened between 1938 and 1947, well, an awful lot happened in that time, right? Because we had World War II. And if you're going through World War II, revising essays isn't necessarily going to be your primary concern. The other thing that's interesting to know about this particular essay is that he gave it right around the time that he was starting to write The Lord of the Rings, after The Hobbit had already been published. So he's already published this very popular book that is commonly thought of as a children's book, and his publisher is eager for him to write something else. And the publisher says, Professor Tolkien, send us your next book. And he does after a long time. And what he sends them is The Lord of the Rings. I think he kind of knew the response he was going to get, which was, what is this? How are we supposed to sell this? Who's supposed to be the audience for this? Because this tradition of epic fantasy that we have nowadays really comes from Tolkien. It didn't exist at the time that he was writing, this tradition of epic fantasy for adults. And so in this essay, he has a bit of an agenda. You can see him justifying the thing that he is doing at that point, which is writing fantasy for adults. He's supposedly talking about fairy tales, but there's a kind of subtext here about the importance of fantasy in general. This essay can be difficult to understand. It's a little easier to understand if you realize that it's structured so that Tolkien can answer a series of questions. And there are 3 questions that he asks. The first of them is, what is a fairy story? Now, Tolkien's a scholar, so how is he going to figure out what a fairy story is? Well, he's going to start with the dictionary, and not just any dictionary, right? He's going to go directly to the Oxford English Dictionary. And the OED suggests, first of all, that a fairy story is a story about fairies. And Tolkien says this is totally wrong. So look on page 38 of the essay. Um, and he says that that definition doesn't work. And he gives us an alternative. Top of the page, he says, I said the sense stories about fairies was too narrow. It is too narrow, even if we reject the diminutive size. For fairy stories are not in normal English usage stories about fairies or elves, but stories about, and he capitalizes this, fairy, that is, and now he spells it differently. Um, and the way he spells it, you would pronounce something like Feria, the realm or state in which fairies have their being. Feria contains many things besides elves and fays, and besides dwarves, witches, trolls, giants, or dragons. It holds the seas, the sun, the moon, the sky, and the earth and all things that are in it, tree and bird, water and stone, wine and bread, and ourselves, mortal men, when we are enchanted. Now, I'm not going to keep saying feria, right? I'm just going to say fairy because otherwise it's going to sound silly. He goes on to say stories that are actually concerned primarily with fairies, that is, with creatures that might also in modern English be called elves, and he actually preferred the word elves, are relatively rare and as a rule not very interesting. Most good fairy stories are about the adventures of men in the perilous realm or upon its shadowy marches. So, what characterizes fairy, 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 the perilous realm? He says on page 39, for the moment I will say only this, a fairy story is one which touches on or uses fairy, fairia, whatever its own main purpose may be, satire, adventure, morality, fantasy. Fairy itself may perhaps most nearly be translated by magic. But it is magic of a peculiar mood and power at the furthest pole from the vulgar devices of the laborious scientific magician. Now, for one thing, the magician's magic is fake, right? The magic of fairy is real and true. So, for Tolkien, a fairy story is one that happens in fairy, in this particular realm. Then, what he wants to do is distinguish this kind of story from other kinds of stories. And there are three other kinds of stories that he wants to distinguish it from. The first is a traveler's tale. Here you want to think about something like Gulliver's Travels. A traveler's tale has all sorts of fantastical elements to it, but those elements are fantastical simply because the traveler's tale happens somewhere far away. It's not in fairy, it simply happens in a distant part of our own world. The second part, the second kind of story that he wants to distinguish from a fairy story is a dream story. This is a story where somebody wakes up and says, oh, all this magical stuff happened, but it was all a dream. It wasn't real. Um, Alice in Wonderland is a really good example here. We might think of Alice in Wonderland as a fairy tale. Some people have characterized it as that. I don't think Tolkien would have. There's an interesting point here, which is that in the US, we have the Oz stories and the famous movie, The Wizard of Oz. Now, The Wizard of Oz movie version is a dream story. Dorothy wakes up at the end. But if you look at the books, and there are a whole bunch of Oz books, and eventually, somewhere around the middle of the series, Dorothy actually moves to Oz. Those are not dream stories. Those happen in Oz, a real Oz that actually exists. And Frank Baum meant those stories to be American fairy tales explicitly. He thought that the old European fairy tales were too dark for modern children, that they would be difficult for the children of his time to relate to. So he wanted to write American fairy tales, and that's what the Oz stories are actually supposed to be. The third type of story that Tolkien distinguishes is a beast fable. Now, for a beast fable, think about something like Aesop's fables. They are about about animals, right? And there is a kind of magical element in them, in that the animals can talk. But that's the only magical element. There's really nothing else in those stories that makes them magical. It's just talking animals, and the talking animals really are symbols. like symbols of human foibles or human aspirations. They're there to teach us lessons. This causes a bit of a problem because some things we usually characterize as fairy tales, like the Three Little Pigs, well, Tolkien might characterize them as beast fables. It's hard to tell. He's not here, so we can actually ask him. But these are the three types of stories that he says are not fairy tales. Okay, so second question he asks is, what is the origin of fairy tales? Where do they come from? He's not actually very interested in this question. He doesn't think it's an interesting question. He says, look, folklorists have been fighting over this question, and they fight over whether fairy tales come from independent invention. Now, independent invention is when person A makes up a story, and person B makes up a story, and person C makes up a story. And it's, the stories are very similar to each other, but they come from different places. Or inheritance from a common ancestor. So person A makes up a story, and then that gets passed down to person B and person C and person D, and the story comes from a common source. Or the third possibility is diffusion. A tells a story to B, tells a story to C, tells a story to D. And he says, this is not actually very important because fairy tales can arise in all of these ways. All of these are legitimate ways for fairy tales to arise. And in the history of fairy tales, we can't really tell often how fairy tales have arisen and the different modes of transmission. What's more important for him is an image. And here I wish I had a blackboard. If I had a blackboard, I would draw a big circle and I would draw arrows going into that circle. And the circle is supposed to represent Tolkien's idea of the Cauldron of Story. A cauldron is like a really big pot in which you can cook a soup or a stew. And he says there are all sorts of things that go into this pot. One thing that goes in is mythology. Myths are stories about gods. Another thing that goes in is legend. Legends are stories about heroes who are often superhuman. They're like gods, but they're not actually gods. Folklore goes in. Folklore is about ordinary human beings. And then history goes in. Actual historical events can go into the Cauldron of Story, and they get all mixed up together. So think about the story of King Arthur. The story of King Arthur has some mythology that's come into it. We have a figure like Morgan Le Fay, who is related to an ancient Celtic goddess called the Morrigan. As far as scholars know, this is at least a hypothesis. There are fairy tale elements in the story of King Arthur. There are knights riding off and battling giants. And there may be historical elements. There are, of course, legendary elements about heroes, but there may be historical elements. There may have been some sort of military leader that, in some way, also got tangled up in the story of King Arthur. We don't know, or at least not for sure. When the storyteller wants to create a story, he or she has a kind of ladle. This is the thing you scoop soup up with. And the storyteller scoops up the stew, scoops up a ladle full of soup from this huge cauldron of story and has certain ingredients in that ladle. And that's where stories come from. It comes from this huge cauldron. Now, remember when I said, pay attention to Angela Carter using the image of fairy tales being like potato soup. Everyone has their way of making potato soup. And I said, she is referring back pretty explicitly to this image from Tolkien of the Cauldron of Story. She's very aware of where she's getting this image. Okay, third question. This is the one that's really important for Tolkien. This is the one he cares about, which is, what is the value of fairy tales? And the first thing Tolkien talks about here is, we tend to assume they're for children. And he says, no, but they're not. This assumption is very new, and we've already studied this. We've already studied the fact that fairy tales became for children over time, and they became for children in the 1800s, right? As we go through the 1800s, they become more and more for children until we get the Andrew Lang fairy books. There's an irony here because the lecture series in which Tolkien is giving this lecture is named after Andrew Lang, and he's attacking Lang actually in some ways. He respects Lang, but he also disagrees with Lang. So it's kind of funny. It's like this little battle of the scholars, except Andrew Lang wasn't there to battle back. So Tolkien is saying Fairy tales have become for children. But when they become exclusively for children, we lose something. So they shouldn't be just for children. First, they tend to be dumbed down, right? Because we're like, well, they're for children, and so we need to make them simpler, and we need to make them not as dark. So people change fairy tales once they think they're only for children. The other thing is that adults lose out on something because adults actually need the things that fairy tales provide more than children do. Fairy tales provide four things, and these are very important to Tolkien. Those four things are fantasy, recovery, escape, and consolation. Let's take fantasy first. Fantasy is the ability to imagine something that does not exist, and then, through art, to make it real to someone else. You need to know a little bit about Tolkien as a person to understand what he's doing here. Tolkien was a religious man, he was Catholic. And so for him, we have a world, our world, right? The world that we all live in. And this is a world that is a creation because it's created by a creator who is God. So we have a creator God creating the world, which is the primary world, the primary creation. When an author creates a world that is different from our primary world, a fantastical world, Tolkien calls that a secondary world, and he calls that act subcreation. It is a godlike act. And he says that to do that and to give that world what he calls, quote unquote, the inner consistency of reality, that in and of itself is a kind of magic and it's a powerful act. Now, remember, this is a guy who is writing The Lord of the Rings, right? So look at page 70. Here's what Tolkien says about this act of subcreation. He says, anyone inheriting the fantastic device of human language can say, the green sun. Many can then imagine or picture it, but that is not enough, though it may already be a more potent thing than maybe a thumbnail sketch or transcript of life that receives literary praise. To make a secondary world inside which the green sun will be credible, commanding secondary belief, will probably require labor and thought, and will certainly demand a special skill, a kind of elvish craft. Few attempt such difficult tasks. This is exactly what he's doing, right? But when they're attempted and in any degree accomplished, then we have a rare achievement of art. Indeed, narrative art, story making in its primary and most potent mode. So he is defending fairy tales, he is defending fantasy, and he is defending the fantasy author, saying that in fact, this kind of creation is the highest kind of creation, the most potent and most magical kind of art. Second thing that fairy tales give us, according to Tolkien, is recovery. And here, I want you to think of these snow days that we're having. When it started to snow and when the snow got really deep, did you think, oh, this is so exciting? Look at that. It's beautiful out there. I want to go play in it. You may have, you may not have. If you were a child, you would, right? Children get very excited about snow days. They want to go play in the snow. That's what they do. They have this sense of wonder about the world. As we become adults, we lose that and we think, snow day, hey, I can goof off and I can catch up on my Netflix series or something like that. We tend to become blasé. Think about a child seeing a bug on a sidewalk. That child will crouch down and will be looking, right? And you'll go, what are you looking at? And they'll say, oh, I saw a bug. Look at that bug. And the child will be so excited about it. Well, Tolkien is saying we tend to lose the sense of excitement as we grow older. Fantasy and fairy tales can help us recover that sense of wonder. So look at page 77, top of the page. talking about this sense of dullness that we get to as adults. And he says, before we reach such states, we need recovery. We should look at green again and be startled anew, but not blinded by blue and yellow and red. We should meet the centaur and the dragon, and then perhaps suddenly behold, like the ancient shepherds, sheep and dogs and horses and wolves, like in Little Red Riding Hood. This recovery fairy stories help us to make. In that sense, only a taste for them may make us or keep us childish. Recovery, which includes return and renewal of health, is a regaining of a clear view. So fairy stories can help us see the world more clearly again. They can help us re-see what is actually there. Escape. Escape is a problem for fairy tales because people often accuse fairy tales of being escapist. This is one of the criticisms of fairy tales that is still leveled. And you've heard this. You've heard the Harry Potter series, for example, being described as escapist. And people saying that's not good for children. It allows children to think that you can solve things magically, but you can't. You have to um, live in real life, right? And you have to solve things the way you would in the real world. Escape takes you away from the real world, and that's not a good thing. Well, Tolkien completely disagrees with that. He says escape is a good thing. First of all, we all have a right to escape from reality. If our realities are ugly or dull or we don't like them or they're uncomfortable or the world is cruel, we have a right to get away from it for a while. Now, remember, this is a guy who has lived through World War I and World War II. He has seen the ugliness of human nature. He has seen the worst that human beings can do. And he's saying, look, if you need to escape from that, you have a right to escape from it. He says on page 79, I have claimed that escape is one of the main functions of fairy stories, and since I do not disapprove of them, it is plain that I do not accept the tone of scorn or pity in which escape is now so often used, a tone for which the uses of the word outside literary criticism give no warrant at all. In what the misusers are fond of calling real life, escape is evidently, as a rule, very practical and may even be heroic. In real life, it is difficult to blame it unless it fails. In criticism, it would seem to be the worst, the better it succeeds. Evidently, we are faced by a misuse of words and also by a confusion of thought. Why should a man be scorned if, finding himself in prison, he tries to get out and go home? Or if, when he cannot do so, he thinks and talks about other topics than jailers and prison walls? The world outside has not become less real because the prisoner cannot see it. In using escape in this way, the critics have chosen the wrong word, and what is more, they are confusing, not always by sincere error, the escape of the prisoner with the flight of the deserter. If you escape from the world for a while, it doesn't mean you're deserting it. In fact, Tolkien implies, and I think this is a very important implication, he implies that if you can escape from the world for a while, not only can you recover and come back to it cleansed and healed, right? You can see it anew. Not only that, but if the world looks ugly to you and you escape to something that you think is better, you may come back to the world and you may say, hang on a minute here. The world does not have to be the way it is. We can change it. We can make it better. We can make it look more like what we want it to look like these other things that I escaped to. I don't think it's a coincidence that Tolkien became really popular in the 60s on college campuses when there were radical movements going on. And people were starting to get interested in environmentalism for the first time. Um, Tolkien and his imaginary world have prompted a lot of people to rethink the world we live in and to say, you know what, we don't actually like this. We want it to be different. We want it to be more magical. So that's escape. The last of the four categories is really important to Tolkien. He calls it consolation, and he links it to the idea of the happy ending. And this is something we're used to thinking about when we think about fairy tales, right? We're used to them starting with once upon a time and then ending happily ever after. Um, he says that consolation is fundamental to the fairy tale. On page 85, he says, but the consolation of fairy tales has another aspect than the imaginative satisfaction of ancient desires. Far more important is the consolation of the happy ending. Almost I would venture to assert that all complete fairy stories must have it. At least I would say that tragedy is the true form of drama, its highest function, but the opposite is true of fairy story. Since we do not appear to possess a word that expresses this opposite, I will call it eucatastrophe. The eucatastrophic tale is the true form of fairy tale and its highest function. Look at what he's done. He's made up a word. Um, he's allowed to do that, right? Because he's Professor Tolkien and he's a philologist. This is the guy who made up Elvish. Where is he getting it from? Well, he's getting it from ancient Greek, and he just talked about drama. He's using a word from ancient Greek drama, which is the strophe. The strophe in ancient Greek drama was an ode or chant. So the chorus in drama would process one way across the stage. Um, they're processing and they're chanting something, and that is the strophe. And then they would turn around and they would chant something else, and that would be the antistrophe. It's like a theme and a counter theme almost. So strophe is a word that means to turn. It's a turning. Um, Catastrophe, the cata part of it is sudden. This is a sudden turn. Now, when we think catastrophe, nowadays we usually use it for something really bad, like an earthquake, a car accident, a hurricane, something like that. Catastrophic snowstorm, as we've been having around here. Um, but it really means a sudden turn. And the eucatastrophe, eu means good in ancient Greek. Something like euphoria. Think about the word euphoria. The eu part of it, that's the same stem. It means something good. So the eucatastrophe is the good sudden turn. It's when you've been working in the house as a servant for your stepmother and stepsisters. And all of a sudden, the prince shows up and he's got a shoe and he says, I will only marry the girl who fits the shoe. And guess what? You're the girl. You fit the shoe. You get to leave that situation and marry the man you love and become queen. And that's your happy ending, right? That's the eucatastrophe. That's the fortunate turn. Now, why is this so important to Tolkien? We talked about the fact that he is coming at this from a religious perspective. And for him, we have a God who has created the world, which is the primary world, and that is the creation. We have an artist who has created a secondary world, and that is the subcreation. In the subcreation, the artist is promising you a happy ending, is saying we have the possibility of eucatastrophe. And that's a statement that for Tolkien is deeply and fundamentally true, because the bigger story is the story of the creation. And if you look at it from a religious sense, there is a promise, a religious promise that all endings, no matter what happens on this plane, in the end, all endings are going to be happy. And fairy tales make that promise. So for Tolkien, fairy tales are giving us a fundamentally true message. They may not be true to the ordinary lives we live, but they contain a deeper truth about life and about our destinies, which is that we are all promised happy endings eventually. Okay, so that's what I have to say about Tolkien. We will take this up again in class. If you have any questions, please let me know. And I will talk to you soon. Have a good snow day. And I hope you go out and I hope you go play in the snow. I'll see you soon.